They called it justice. The kingdom called it necessary. But if you looked closely, and I mean really closely, at the faces of the royal family that day, you wouldn't see justice. You'd see relief. The execution arena was filled to capacity. Every seat taken. Every eye forward. The kind of crowd that doesn't gather for justice. They gather because something inside them needs to be watched. I need to see it happen. Torches lined the stone walls even though it was midday. The kingdom wanted this moment lit. I wanted to see it. I wanted it remembered. A slow drumbeat rolled across the arena like a warning no one intended to heed. And then, the gates opened. It came out low to the ground at first. Not charging. Not roaring. Just emerging. Like it had all the time in the world. The royal monster. 7 feet of muscle, shadow, and ancient rage that the kingdom had kept chained beneath the palace for longer than most people had been alive. They only released it for one reason. Execution. And as it rose to its full height, as the crowd collectively stopped breathing, one small figure stood at the center of the arena floor. No armor. No weapon. No escort. Just a girl. Her dark hair caught the wind. Her hands were bound in front of her with iron rope. Her feet were bare against the cold stone. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't even flinch when the monster's eyes, those horrible, glowing amber eyes, locked directly onto her. She just stood there. And that is what nobody in that arena could explain afterward. Now, before we go any further, what do you think is the crime of the girl in the execution arena ready to be devoured by the beast? I need you to ask yourself something. When a kingdom decides to throw a girl to a monster, not a criminal, not a traitor, not a warlord, just a girl, what exactly did she do? Drop your thoughts on the comments section. Subscribe and like. Every subscription and like helps the video reach many people. That's the question everyone in that arena thought they knew the answer to. The royal decree had been read publicly 3 days before. She was guilty of corruption of royal blood. Vague. Deliberate. The kind of charge that means everything and nothing at once. The kind of charge you create when the real reason is too dangerous to say out loud. Because here is what the kingdom did not tell its people. The royal family had been trying to remove this girl for over 8 months. For 8 months, the royal family tried everything. Quiet removals. Failed schemes. Secret meetings that grew more desperate by the week. Why? Because every time they tried to get rid of her, something impossible happened. We'll come back to that. But what I want you to notice right now, what I want you to sit with, is the fact that the king himself attended that execution. Kings do not attend executions. They sign orders. They move on. But King Aldrich was in the front royal box, fingers gripping the stone railing, eyes fixed on that girl with an expression that was not satisfaction. It was anxiety. Like a man watching something he desperately hopes will finally work. Finally. She had her eyes closed. Not in prayer. Not in fear. In something that looked like concentration. As though she was waiting for something. Her name was Lena. And 3 months ago, she had a life. Small. Quiet. Hers. She worked in the lower palace kitchens, the ones nobody visits, the ones tucked so far beneath the grand halls that the noise from the kingdom above barely reached her. She had a cot, a few books, and a window that caught exactly 40 minutes of sunlight every morning. She was content. Not happy. Content. She wasn't born into power. She wasn't gifted with magic. She had no noble blood, no influential family, no one watching out for her. She was the kind of person kingdoms forget exist. Until the day the kingdom could not afford to forget her anymore. Until the day something happened that she didn't ask for. Something she didn't choose. Something that, once it began, could not be undone. And suddenly the most powerful family in the realm had one thought, and one thought only. She has to go. Back in the arena. The monster was moving now. Not fast. Deliberately. Each step sent vibrations through the stone floor. The crowd had gone silent. The drums had stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold still. Lena opened her eyes. She looked at the creature approaching her. This ancient thing that had ended dozens of lives in that very arena. And something passed across her face. Not fear. Not acceptance. Something closer to recognition. 20 feet. The monster's amber eyes hadn't left her. 15 feet. The king leaned forward in the royal box. 10 feet. Lena exhaled slowly. And whispered something. One word. Too quiet for anyone in the crowd to hear. 5 feet. And then? But to understand what happened next, you need to go back 3 months. At night everything changed. The night Lena stumbled into a part of the palace she was never supposed to enter. And found something the royal family had spent decades trying to keep hidden. That is where this story really begins. Let me tell you about the girl before the arena. Before the chains. Before the charges. Before the crowd. Lena on an ordinary morning. She was awake before the sun. She always was. I learned to navigate them without making a sound. Learned which floorboards creaked, which corners echoed, which hallways to avoid when certain nobles were in a bad mood. She'd had to learn all of it. Nobody taught her. Lena had lived in the palace since she was 6 years old. She ate in the servants' quarters. Slept in a room barely large enough to fit a bed and a chest of drawers. Wore plain gray cloth while everyone around her moved through marble halls in silk and gold. She was not a servant, technically. But she was not a nobility either. She existed in the space between, and in a palace built entirely on hierarchy, that space was a very uncomfortable place to live. The servants didn't fully accept her because she hadn't come up through their ranks. The nobles didn't acknowledge her because acknowledging her would require explaining why she was there. And nobody, not one person in that entire palace, ever explained why she was there. Oh, there were rumors. There are always rumors in palaces. Some said she was the illegitimate child of a disgraced lord, dumped at the palace gates as an infant with nothing but a name and a sealed letter that no one ever discussed again. Some said she was foreign, from across the northern mountains, from a bloodline the kingdom had reasons to keep quiet about. The kitchen women had their own theory. They'd whisper it when they thought she wasn't listening. Something about the way she carried herself. Something about her eyes, dark, steady, never quite looking away when she should. That girl, one of the older cooks used to say, shaking her head slowly, is not what she looks like. She never explained what she meant. And Lena had long since stopped asking. Now, the palace itself. You need to understand the world she was living inside. Because it wasn't just a home. It was a battlefield. A very well-decorated, chandelier-lit battlefield. At the top, Queen Seraphine. Beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful. Precise. Cold. Deliberate. She had married King Eldred 22 years ago and spent every one of those years quietly, methodically ensuring that power flowed through her hands before it reached his. She didn't rule from the throne. She ruled from 3 steps behind it, which is a far more effective position than most people realize. She had noticed Lena years ago. And she had never stopped watching her since. Then there was Princess Karina. The king's only daughter. 18 years old, perfectly trained, perfectly dressed, and perfectly miserable about it. She wasn't cruel the way her mother was, calculating and patient. Karina's cruelty was the hot, immediate kind. The kind that comes from insecurity dressed up as superiority. She had tormented Lena since childhood in the small, deniable ways that noble women specialize in. A snide remark at dinner. A task assigned specifically to humiliate. An invitation extended and then publicly withdrawn. The kind of thing you couldn't report. The kind of thing that, if you tried to explain it to someone, would make you sounds like a problem. Lena had learned to absorb it without expression. That, somehow, seemed to bother Karina most of all. And the king. King Eldrick. He was not a bad man. That's the most honest thing you can say about him. He was not bad, he was just not enough. Not strong enough for the court he governed. Not decisive enough for the nobles who circled his throne like wolves testing the edges of a fire. He knew Lena was there. He'd even spoken to her, once or twice over the years, brief, awkward exchanges that ended with him looking slightly pained and walking away quickly. Like she reminded him of something he'd rather not think about. She had stopped expecting kindness a long time ago. What she wanted, what she'd always wanted, though she'd never said it out loud to anyone, was simply to understand. To know why she was here. To know where she actually came from. To know why certain people in this palace looked at her with an expression she couldn't name, not quite pity, not quite fear, something in between. She'd tried, over the years, to find answers. She'd looked for records in the palace archives. Gone twice, after dark, when the archivist had gone home. The second time, she found exactly what she'd been afraid of. The section that should have contained records from the year she arrived was empty. Not disorganized. Not misplaced. Empty. Pages removed. Cleanly. Intentionally. Someone had gotten there before her. There was one more thing. The elderly servants, the ones who had worked the palace for 30, 40 years, behaved strangely around her. Not all of them. But enough. A head tilted too quickly away when she entered a room. Hands that stopped moving mid-task when she walked past. Old Marin, who had worked the East Wing laundry for 43 years, had grabbed Lena's wrist once, just once, in the corridor near the storage rooms. Gripped it hard. Looked at her with wet, urgent eyes. Said, "You should leave this place. While you still can." And then let go. I walked away. Never mentioned it again. Refused to meet her eyes after that. Lena had tried to convince herself it meant nothing. She was not particularly successful. It was a Tuesday when she found it. Unremarkable in every other way. She was cleaning the old storage corridor on the east side of the palace, a job she'd been assigned as a quiet punishment for being seen somewhere Karina didn't want her. The corridor was rarely used. Dusty. Lined with old crates and covered furniture and the general debris of a palace that had been accumulating history for 300 years. She almost missed it. She was moving a heavy crate when a section of the stone wall behind it caught the torchlight differently. She stopped. Leaned closer. And there, carved directly into the stone, worn with age but unmistakable, was a symbol. A circle, bisected by two lines, with a small mark at the center that she'd never seen anywhere in the palace before. Except once. She'd seen it once. In the Royal Portrait Gallery, on the oldest painting in the collection, a portrait so old the nameplate had been removed. The figure in the painting wore the symbol on a chain around their neck. She'd asked, as a child, who the person in the portrait was. The attendant had gone very still. Then said, "No one is important." And changed the subject. Lena stared at the carving on the wall for a long time. Then she did something she'd taught herself, over years of surviving in this palace, never to do. She started asking questions. To understand why that symbol on the wall mattered. You need to go back. Far back. Before King Eldrick. Before Queen Seraphine. Before the palace looked the way it looks now, all polished marble and political maneuvering and carefully maintained appearances. Back to the beginning of the kingdom itself. 300 years ago, this land had a different name. It was called Varenthus. And Varenthus was not built by armies or diplomacy or the slow accumulation of wealth. It was built by a covenant. A pact between the first ruling family, the Dravens, and something that lived in the deep forests beyond the northern mountains. Something ancient. Something that had existed long before humans had names for things like kingdoms or crowns or power. The early records, the ones that survived, anyway, describe it simply as the Bound. Not a monster. Not a beast. The Bound. A creature of immense, terrible strength, yes. But also something else. Something the early scribes struggled to articulate. They used words like aware and deliberate and, in one manuscript, a word that translates roughly to sovereign, though they crossed it out and wrote it again 3 times, as though they couldn't decide if they meant it. The covenant worked like this. The Bound would serve as protector of the realm. Guardian. A force so formidable that no enemy would dare test the kingdom's borders. In return, the ruling family owed it something that had no clean translation in modern language. The closest word we have is recognition. Not worship. Not sacrifice. Recognition. The Bound needed to know that the people it served were legitimate. That the bloodline it had entered covenant with was still intact. Still real. Still worthy of the arrangement. As long as that recognition held, the kingdom was untouchable. And then something happened. What we know is this. Approximately 200 years ago, the Draven bloodline ended. Publicly, it was recorded as a tragedy. Disease. The last Draven ruler dying without an heir. The throne passed to a connected noble family. Legitimate, by the standards of the court. Approved by every council and clerk and religious authority the kingdom had. But not by the Bound. The new rulers tried to maintain the covenant. They performed the old rituals. Spoke the old words. Stood before the creature in the ceremonial chamber beneath the palace and waited for the recognition that the old records promised would come. It didn't come. The Bound simply looked at them. And looked away. Over the generations that followed, the covenant became a formality. Then a legend. Then something vaguely embarrassing that the royal family kept locked in the basement, metaphorically and eventually quite literally. The creature that had once been called the Bound became the royal monster. A weapon, since it couldn't be a partner. A threat held in reserve, since it couldn't be an ally. A thing to be used and feared and never fully understood. The prophecy, the one written by the last Draven court scribe in the final year of that bloodline, was declared lost. Officially. The royal archives recorded it as destroyed in a fire 2 centuries ago. This was not entirely true. The prophecy was 4 lines. Old language, difficult to translate precisely. But the meaning, across every version that privately circulated among certain scholars over the centuries, was consistent. When the blood that was scattered returns to stand before the Bound, it will know. And what was broken in the breaking of the covenant will not remain broken. 4 lines. Vague enough to dismiss. Specific enough to terrify, if you were the kind of person whose power depended on the old covenant staying permanently, irreversibly dead. Now. 3 days later Lena found the symbol on the wall. She hadn't told anyone. She wasn't sure why, instinct, maybe. The same quiet instinct that had kept her safe in this palace for 17 years. But she'd made a mistake. A small one. She'd gone back to look at the portrait in the gallery. Stood in front of it for perhaps 4 minutes longer than was wise. She didn't know that one of Queen Seraphine's attendants had been passing through the corridor. Didn't know the attendant had paused. I looked at Lena. I looked at the portrait. I looked at Lena again. And then walked, at a controlled and unhurried pace, directly to the Queen's private chambers. Seraphine held her meeting that evening. Small gathering. Closed doors. For people who had spent years carefully ensuring that certain old questions stayed buried. The royal advisor, Lord Casson, a thin, precise man who kept files on everyone in the palace and spoke in the tone of someone who considered emotion a character flaw. The head archivist, who had been in his position for 26 years specifically because he understood which records needed to quietly disappear. The captain of the palace guard, who understood how to make problems smaller without asking unnecessary questions. And the queen. Lena knew none of this. She was in her room by then, sitting on the edge of her bed, turning the shape of the symbol over and over in her mind. What she also didn't know was that 2 floors above her, Lord Casson had opened a leather folio on Seraphine's table. Inside were notes. Observations accumulated quietly over months. Things he had noticed and catalogued and said nothing about, waiting to see if they amounted to anything. A servant who had recognized something in Lena's face. A scholar who had made an offhand comment about old bloodlines and been gently, firmly reassigned to a post 3 kingdoms away. The records Lena had gone looking for in the archive, the ones already removed. Someone had been watching her long before she started watching back. It's accelerating, Casson said, in the way people say things they've been thinking for a long time. The queen didn't respond immediately. She stood at the window, looking out at the courtyard below. Then we accelerate, she said finally. The archivist left that meeting and went directly to his office. There was one thing he hadn't yet handled. One document that had survived when it shouldn't have, a single handwritten ledger from 300 years ago, stored in a wax-sealed case at the back of a shelf he'd always intended to get to. It contained a name. A family name. And a record of what had been done with the last surviving member of that family when the old bloodline fell. He found the case. Broke the seal. Removed the ledger. He had carried it to the fireplace and was reaching for the iron grate when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He turned. The footsteps passed. He turned back to the fire. And in the moment before the ledger caught the flame, in the very last second, his eye fell on a line near the bottom of the last page. A notation. Dated 60 years after the main entry. His hand slowed. He read it again. Then a third time. His expression didn't change, he was too well trained for that. But his hand, holding the ledger over the fire, stopped moving. "Oh," he said quietly. To no one. In the way you say it when something you thought was a rumor turns out to be a fact. "Oh." It started with a missing necklace. That's how these things always start, isn't it? Not with something dramatic. Not with a grand accusation delivered in a throne room. Just a missing necklace. Princess Karina's, a thin gold chain with a sapphire pendant that had belonged to her grandmother. Sentimental. Irreplaceable. And according to Karina, last seen on her dressing table the morning Lena had been assigned to clean the upper chambers. Lena hadn't taken it. She knew better than to touch anything in those rooms. Had always known better. Had spent 17 years being careful in exactly this way. But careful, as it turns out, only protects you until someone decides it won't. The first search of her room found nothing. She'd almost exhaled. The second search, conducted 2 days later, by different guards, without warning, found the necklace tucked inside the lining of her winter coat. She stared at it when they held it up. She had never seen that coat opened. Had barely worn it in months. She said this. The guard's expression didn't change. "You'll need to come with us," he said. "Here is the thing about being accused of something in a palace. The truth is almost beside the point. What matters is the story, who tells it first, how consistently it gets repeated, and whether anyone with power has a reason to make it stick." And the story, by the time Lena was brought before the royal hearing, had grown considerably beyond a missing necklace. The hearing was held in the East Council chamber. Smaller than the throne room. More intimate. Which, in this context, meant there was nowhere to look that wasn't looking back at you. Lena stood at the center. No chair. No one beside her. Around the long table sat Lord Casson. 3 senior nobles. The captain of the palace guard. And Queen Seraphine, positioned just slightly apart from the others, close enough to observe, removed enough to appear uninvolved. She had the expression of someone attending out of reluctant duty. Lena had seen that expression before. She knew what it cost to maintain it. The first witness was a junior kitchen maid named Petra. Sweet girl. Nervous. Couldn't meet Lena's eyes. She testified that she had seen Lena near the princess's chambers on multiple occasions outside of her assigned duties. This was technically true. The corridor in question connected to the laundry route Lena sometimes took as a shortcut. She'd used it for years. The framing around it, the pauses, the careful questions from Lord Casson, turned it into something else entirely. The second witness was a noble's attendant Lena had never spoken to directly. He testified that Lena had asked him, some weeks ago, about the princess's schedule. About when her rooms were typically empty. Lena had no memory of this conversation. Because it had never happened. She said so, clearly, when asked. Casson wrote something down without looking up. The third witness didn't look at her at all. And then there was Dara. Dara had worked the kitchens for 9 years. She and Lena weren't close, the palace didn't leave much room for closure, but they'd shared early mornings and late nights and the particular kind of understanding that develops between two people who both know what it means to be invisible in a place like this. Lena had thought, if she had anything approaching a friend in that palace, it might have been Dara. Dara was called to the chamber toward the end. She sat across from Lena. Folded her hands on the table. Kept her eyes down for a long moment. Then I looked up. And what Lena saw in her face wasn't cruelty. It was fear. Pure, quiet, animal fear. The kind that makes people do things they'll spend years trying not to think about. She spoke about the princess often, Dara said. She resented her. She said so. Lena said nothing. Not because she didn't have words. Because she understood, in that moment, what had been done to Dara before this hearing ever started. What had been said to her. What had been implied about what would happen if she didn't cooperate. She understood it completely. And it didn't make it hurt less. The evidence, when Casson presented it in full, was immaculate. That was the word Lena kept returning to, standing there listening to it. Immaculate. Not pieced together. Not rough at the edges in the way real evidence usually is. Every piece fits cleanly against the next. Every gap filled. Every counter-argument anticipated and addressed. This had not been assembled quickly. This had been built. Carefully. Over time. By people who were very good at this kind of construction. The necklace was real. The witnesses were real, their fear was real, their words were real, the pressure applied to produce those words was real. But the story they added up to was fiction. A perfect, airtight, unassailable fiction. And Lena stood in the middle of it with nothing. No advocate. No counter-witness. No evidence of her own. No one in that room whose interest was served by her innocence. When Casson finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Queen Seraphine, who had not spoken once during the entire proceedings, turned to the king. Aldrich had been seated at the far end of the table. He hadn't looked at Lena directly since she'd entered the room. He looked at his hands. Then at Seraphine. She said nothing. She didn't need to. He cleared his throat. The charges, he said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound certain, are substantiated. The room didn't react. Because the room already knew. The formal charge was theft and deliberate manipulation of the royal household. But there was a secondary charge attached, one that Lena hadn't anticipated. Casson read it in the same even tone he'd used for everything else. Conspiring to undermine the stability of the royal bloodline. She looked at him when he said it. He didn't look back. And in the careful, deliberate choice of that particular charge, in its vagueness, in its severity, in the way it had slipped in alongside the other, Lena finally understood the full shape of what was happening to her. The necklace was never the point. It was never about the necklace. The king stood. He still wasn't looking at her. He spoke toward the middle distance, in the practiced tone of a man reciting something he has been told to say. Given the severity of the charges, and the threat posed to the stability of this house, the court finds the accused guilty. Pause. The sentence will be carried out in 3 days' time. Another pause. Shorter. She will be delivered to the royal monster. The room was silent. Lena didn't move. She stood exactly as she had stood since she entered, shoulders back, eyes forward, face still. She would not give them a reaction to record. She would not give them tears to feel satisfied by. She would not give them anything else. Only Seraphine was watching her closely enough to notice the one thing Lena couldn't fully control. The moment, half a second, no more. When something shifted behind her eyes. Not fear. Something older than fear. Something that looked, to someone paying careful enough attention, I almost like understanding. They gave her a cell in the lower palace. Not the dungeon was for people the kingdom wanted to punish before they killed them. Cold stone, no light, the sound of water dripping somewhere in the dark. The cell they gave Lena was almost considerate by comparison. A small window. A cot with a blanket. A candle that they replaced each morning without being asked. She didn't know what to make of that, at first. Then she decided it didn't matter. She had 3 days. She chose not to spend them being confused about candles. The first day, she slept. More than she had in years, actually. Something about the finality of her situation seemed to have released her from the low constant tension she'd carried so long she'd stopped noticing it. The vigilance. The careful watching. The permanent, exhausting awareness of how she moved through rooms, who was nearby, what expression she was wearing. None of that was necessary anymore. She slept, and she didn't dream, and when she woke up the candle had been replaced and there was food on the floor outside the bars. She ate it. Then she sat with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up and she let herself, for the first time in a very long time, simply think. She thought about the kitchen. Not the grand palace kitchen, the small one. The lower one. The one she'd worked before they reassigned her upstairs 3 years ago. She thought about the smell of it in winter. Bread and wood smoke and the particular warmth that only comes from a room where something has been cooking for hours. Above her, the palace continued. And the kingdom continued beyond it. Word has spread quickly, the way bad news does in places where people are hungry for it. In the merchant quarters, people discussed it over counters and in doorways with the particular energy of those who are relieved the story isn't about them. In the noble households, reactions were more calibrated, careful expressions of appropriate concern, private satisfaction kept at a respectable distance from public view. In the palace kitchens, it was very quiet. Bess stood at her work table for most of the afternoon and chopped things that didn't need chopping. Nobody talked to her about it. Nobody talked about it at all, in the kitchens. They just worked harder than usual, and kept their eyes down, and the silence had a texture to it that everyone understood without naming. In the lower districts, the reaction was more complicated. Some celebrated, or performed celebration, which is not quite the same thing. The proclamation had framed Lena as a threat to the royal household, and there is a particular kind of person who, when told by authority that something is dangerous, directs their fear outward in whatever direction they'd been pointed. But there were others. A cloth merchant's wife who had seen the girl once, buying thread, and remembered her for no specific reason. A guard who had walked the lower corridor for 6 years and had always found her quietly present at strange hours, reading, not lurking, and had never once seen her cause a problem for anyone. An old man who sat every morning in the square near the palace gates, who heard the proclamation read aloud and then sat for a very long time saying nothing, watching the pigeons, thinking thoughts he kept to himself. Unease doesn't make noise the way celebration does. But it was there. Let me tell you about the royal monster. Not the version from the arena, you've already seen that. I mean history. The weight of it. The creature had been used for executions 11 times in recorded history. 11. Each time, the outcome had been the same. The condemned was placed in the arena. The gates opened. The monster emerged. And within minutes, sometimes less, it was over. No exceptions. The kingdom had, over centuries, developed a certain mythology around this consistency. People spoke about it the way they speak about forces of nature, not with moral judgment, just with the flat acceptance of something inevitable. The first recorded execution had been a warlord from the eastern provinces who had led a failed uprising against the crown. Powerful man. Experienced fighter. He'd lasted 4 minutes, by the account of the official record keeper, which noted the time with the detached precision of someone documenting weather. The second had been a noblewoman convicted of poisoning her husband and 2 members of the royal council. She had walked into the arena with her head high. She had not walked out. The accounts varied after that, different crimes, different people, different circumstances. The outcome never varied. What the official records didn't discuss, what lived instead in the unofficial accounts, the scholars' footnotes, the hushed conversations in certain circles, was something stranger. Several witnesses across different executions, across different centuries, had reported the same anomaly. Before the end, in the moments just before, the monster would stop. Not retreat. Do not hesitate in any fearful sense. Just pause. And look at the condemned with an expression that witnesses struggled to describe. Considering, one wrote. Measuring, said another. As though it were waiting for something, a third account read. That did not come. And then it would continue. And it will be over. No one had ever identified what it was waiting for. No one had ever provided it. On the second night, a guard passing her cell slowed. He was young, newer to the post, she thought. He paused outside the bars and looked at her with the slightly uncomfortable expression of someone who has a question they know they shouldn't ask. She looked back at him and waited. Are you? He stopped. Started again. Are you not frightened? She considered this honestly. Yes, she said. He nodded, seeming slightly relieved by this. But not in the way you mean, she added. He frowned. She didn't elaborate. After a moment, he continued his rounds. Here is the thing she hadn't said to the guard. She was afraid of the pain. She was afraid of the crowd watching. She was afraid of what it would look like, and feel like, and the specifics of how it ended. But she was not, and this was the part she didn't know how to explain, she was not afraid of the monster itself. She didn't know why. She'd tried to examine it the way you examine a wound, looking for the source of the problem. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't denial. It was something more specific. More located. Every time she thought about walking into that arena, every time she let the image fully form in her mind, what she felt, underneath everything else, was not the animal terror she expected. It was something closer to the feeling of a word on the tip of your tongue. Something almost familiar. Something almost like. She stopped that thought every time before it finished. Because finishing it felt, somehow, more frightening than the arena did. The morning of the third day arrived without ceremony. Gray light through the small window. The city already awakened beyond the palace walls. 2 guards came for her before she'd finished her bread. She set it down carefully. Stood. Let them bind her wrists. They walked in silence through the palace and out a side entrance she'd never used before. The air was cold and smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. They didn't rush. She heard the crowd before she saw it. Thousands of people. Not shouting. Waiting. The sound an audience makes before something begins. The arena gates stood ahead. Iron. Old. Massive. They opened slowly. The noise swelled. Lena stepped through. Sunlight struck the arena floor. 10,000 faces turned toward her. And somewhere beneath the stone, in the deep chamber where it had waited for days, something moved. We're back where we started. The arena. The crowd. The sun sitting flat and cold over 10,000 people who came here this morning certain of what they were going to witness. Lena at the center of the floor. Bare feet on cold stone. Wrists bound. And the gates on the far side of the arena, the heavy ones, the iron ones, the ones that only open one way, swing wide. The sound the monster made when it emerged wasn't a roar. It was lower than that. More felt than heard. A vibration that moved through the stone floor, up through the soles of your feet, into your chest. Something ancient. Something that the most instinctive part of the human brain recognized before the conscious mind could name it. The part of you that is still, underneath everything, pray. Every person in that arena felt it simultaneously. The collective inhale of 10,000 people is a sound you don't forget. It moved faster than it had looked capable of moving. That was always the thing witnesses reported afterward, the speed. The size of it made your brain miscalculate. Made you assume something that large would be slow, lumbering, manageable in its approach. It wasn't. It crossed half the arena floor in seconds. The crowd erupted. Not in fear, in release. The compressed, waiting energy of thousands of people finally gave permission to let go. Shouting. Hands gripping the railings. Leaning forward. This was what they came for. Queen Seraphine sat with her hands folded in her lap. Composed. Still. The expression of someone watching a formality reach its conclusion. Beside her, Karina had finally allowed herself a small, private exhale. The king was gripping the railing. He'd been gripping it since Lena walked through the gates. Lord Casson stood slightly to the left, watching not the arena floor but the queen, measuring the moment against his own careful internal accounting. Everything was proceeding correctly. Everything was almost finished. Lena didn't run. She had decided this in the cell, on the second night. She would not run. Not because she wasn't afraid, she was. Her heart was doing something irregular and her hands were cold inside the iron rope and the sound of the crowd was pressing against her from every direction like a physical thing. But running would give them a different ending than the one they'd written for her. A smaller one. She was done making herself small. She stood straight. She watched it come. 40 feet. 30. 20. The monster stopped. No stumbling. No hesitation in the physical sense. Just stopped. Like a word cut off mid-sentence. Like a song ending on the wrong note. 10 feet from her. Close enough that she could see the amber of its eyes in detail. Could see the chest moving with each breath. Could see. It stopped. And the crowd. The crowd didn't know what to do with that. The eruption died so fast it left a ringing absence behind it. 10,000 people fell silent in the span of about 4 seconds. It was the strangest sound Lena had ever heard. The sound of that many people having no script for what they were watching. The monster stood there. Breathing. Looking at her. Not the way it had looked at anything before, not the scanning, threat-assessing awareness of a predator. Something different. Something that sat wrong against every story anyone had ever told about this creature. It was looking at her the way you look at something you have been waiting a very long time to see. Seraphine's hands, still folded in her lap, had gone white at the knuckles. The king had stopped breathing. Casson was no longer watching the queen. He was watching the arena floor with an expression that had abandoned its usual careful blankness and arrived somewhere that might, in different circumstances, be described as awe. What is it doing? Karina whispered. Nobody answered her. Lena and the monster looked at each other. For 3 seconds. 5. 8. Longer than made any sense. Longer than anyone in that arena had a framework for. And Lena, standing there, bound, barefoot, alone in front of something that had ended 11 lives without exception across 3 centuries of recorded history, felt the thing she'd been stopping herself from feeling in the cell. The word on the tip of the tongue. It's almost familiar. It arrived now, fully, without asking permission. Recognition. Not of the creature's face. Not of anything she could point to or explain or trace back to a specific memory. Something older than memory. Something that lived in the part of her that the palace had never touched, that no amount of diminishment or erasure or careful, deliberate removal of records had managed to reach. She felt it. And across 10 feet of cold arena stone. Something in the monster's eyes shifted. Like an answer. It moved. The crowd flinched as one. But not forward. Down. Slowly. Deliberately. With a gravity that made every person watching feel the weight of it without understanding why. One massive foreleg. Then the other. The head, that enormous, terrifying head, lowering. Until the creature that had never bent for anything or anyone in 300 years of captivity. I was kneeling. At her feet. The arena was so silent you could hear the torches. 10,000 people. Not one sound. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The royal box above was absolutely, completely still. Lena looked down at the creature kneeling before her. At the top of its lowered head. At the posture that was not submission. But reverence. And for the first time since the guards had come to her cell that morning. Since the trial. Since the necklace. Since all of it. Something broke open in her chest. Not grief. Not anger. Something she didn't have a word for. Something that felt like the first true breath after a very long time underwater. She didn't understand it yet. Not fully. Not in a way that has clean edges and clear explanations. But somewhere beneath the understanding. She knew. In the way you know things that have always been true, that were true before you had language for them, that no amount of missing records or sealed ledgers or carefully constructed lies could permanently bury. She knew. And in the royal box, high above the silent arena. Queen Seraphine knew too. The question that rippled through 10,000 stunned, silent people in that arena. Why? What does this creature know? What does it see when it looks at her? What is she? Who is she? These questions had no answers yet. But they had something more dangerous than answers. They had witnesses. 10,000 of them. And that was the thing Seraphine had spent 8 months trying to prevent. Let's go back to the archivist. The old man. The fireplace. The ledger he couldn't bring himself to burn. Because that moment, that small, private hesitation in a room no one else was in, was the crack in the wall that everything eventually came through. He didn't burn it. He told himself he would do it later. Later became the next morning. Then the morning after that. He put the ledger in a different place. Somewhere less obvious. Told himself this was temporary. It wasn't. Because the notation he'd seen on that last page, the one that had stopped his hand over the fire, had lodged itself somewhere behind his eyes and refused to leave. He'd spent 40 years as a keeper of records. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, what it meant when the pieces fit. And these pieces fit. Here's what the kingdom was never told. The Draven bloodline did not end. That's the beginning of it. That's the stone everything else was built on top of, the foundational lie, the one you had to maintain perfectly because everything downstream depended on it. 207 years ago, the last official Draven ruler died without a recognized heir. That part was true. Recognized as doing a great deal of work in that sentence. What the court knew, what Cassin's predecessors had known and documented and then systematically buried, was this. There had been a child. Not illegitimate. Not a rumor. A real child, born of a real marriage that the court had chosen not to formally recognize for reasons that were entirely political and entirely deliberate. The mother had been from the northern provinces. Old blood, older than the palace, older than the kingdom's current name. The kind of bloodline that made certain nobles deeply uncomfortable because it predated their own claims to relevance. The marriage had been conducted quietly. The records are sealed. When the last Draven ruler died, the court convened and made a collective, coordinated decision. The child would not be named. The marriage would not be acknowledged. And the throne would pass to the next suitable noble family, which, by remarkable coincidence, was the family whose senior members had been the loudest voices in that particular room. The child was 6 years old. They placed her with a family in the southern provinces and sealed every document that connected her to the palace. They told themselves this was stability. Continuity. The responsible thing. It worked. For a while, it worked exceptionally well. The new ruling family consolidated power quickly. The old covenant with the bound was quietly reclassified from active arrangement to historical curiosity. The creature beneath the palace was reframed, not partner, not guardian, but weapon. Tool. Asset. The prophecy was declared lost. And for nearly 2 centuries, the Draven line survived only in the way things survive when no one is supposed to know about them, quietly, privately, passed from parent to child like a language spoken only at home. Until 3 generations ago, when even that thread became too thin and too dangerous to maintain openly. And the last keeper of it made a decision. She recorded what she knew in a single ledger. Sealed it in wax. Put it somewhere it might survive. And trusted, in the way desperate people trust things they cannot control, that it would eventually be found by the right person. The notation the archivist had seen on the last page of that ledger, the one that had stopped his hand, was a name. And beneath the name, a date. And beneath the date, a location. The lower palace. The east wing. The servants' quarters. And beneath the location, for words written in the cramped, urgent handwriting of someone who knew they were running out of time. She is already here. He sat with that for 3 days. He'd watched the trial. Watched Lena stand in that chamber with nothing and no one while the case was built around her like a room with no doors. He'd written the charge himself. Conspiring to undermine the stability of the royal bloodline. He sat with the irony of that for a long time. Then he made a decision that he understood, clearly and completely, might end his career. His freedom. Possibly more than that. He made a copy of the relevant pages. He sealed it. He gave it to a person he trusted, not in the palace, not connected to the court, with instructions that were simple and specific. If something happens to me, he said, you know where this goes. Then he went back to work. And he waited. The copy reached 3 people before the arena gates had fully closed that morning. A senior palace guard with a conscience that had been bothering him for months. A scholar from the university district who had spent a decade quietly researching the gaps in the kingdom's official history. And a journalist, old-fashioned word, but accurate, who had a printing press and a distribution network and absolutely nothing to lose. They moved quickly. People who had been waiting for something tend to. Queen Seraphine saw it first. Not the documents, she didn't know about those yet. But she'd watched the monster kneel, and she was not a woman who required lengthy explanation. She understood the implication immediately and completely. That was always her particular skill. The speed of her comprehension. The absolute absence of denial. She turned to Cassin. He was already looking at her. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had built something very carefully over a very long time, and they were both watching it, in the space of about 90 seconds, in front of 10,000 witnesses, begin to come apart. Casson was a man who had spent his entire professional life solving problems before they became visible. He was already running calculations. The creature's behavior was the problem, undeniable, public, impossible to reframe quickly. 10,000 witnesses meant 10,000 conversations happening tonight, tomorrow, in every corner of the kingdom. The framing would need to begin immediately. He was already composing language in his mind. Anomalous behavior. Under investigation. No connection to. Then a messenger appeared at the back of the royal box. Slipped through the door. I walked directly to him. Placed a folded paper in his hand with the expression of someone who had been paid to deliver it and had no interest in what happened next. Casson opened it. Read it. Read it again. The calculation stopped. The princess was watching her mother. She had been watching her mother since the monster stopped, reading the stillness in her posture the way she'd learned to read it over 18 years of growing up beside someone who performed composure as a survival mechanism. She had never seen her mother's composure actually cost her something before. She was seeing it now. "What's happening?" she said. Not to the room. Directly to Seraphine. Her mother didn't answer. Karina looked down at the arena floor. At Lena, standing there with her wrists still bound, the monster kneeling before her, neither of them moving. And something happened that Karina hadn't anticipated. Something she would spend a long time afterward failing to fully explain. She thought about the years of small cruelties. The manufactured reasons. The convenient humiliations. 18 years of being told, implicitly and explicitly, that this particular girl needed to be kept in her place. She looked at her mother's white knuckles on the railing. And understood, for the first time, that she had not been taught to dislike Lena out of natural aristocratic instinct. She had been very carefully taught to dislike her. On purpose. By someone who was afraid of her. "Mother," she said again, differently this time. Seraphine turned. And the expression on her face, unguarded, just for a half second, before the mask came back. Told Karina everything. Aldrich hadn't moved. He was still gripping the railing. Still looking at the arena floor. At the girl who had lived in his palace for 17 years. At the creature that had never knelt for anything. The prophecy he'd been told was lost came true in front of 10,000 witnesses while he stood in the royal box having signed the execution order 3 days ago. He thought about the morning she'd arrived. A child. 6 years old. Dark hair. Steady eyes that had looked at him with an openness that had made him deeply, inexplicably uncomfortable. He'd been told what to do. Been told it was necessary. Been told the reasons and had accepted them because accepting them was easier than the alternative. He had not thought about it again. He had tried very hard not to think about it again. He was thinking about it now. He let go of the railing. I looked at his hands. "What did we do?" he said. Quietly. To no one. To himself. To the particular kind of silence that arrives when a person who has been avoiding a question finally stops running from it. What did we do? Below, in the arena. Lena didn't know any of this yet. She didn't know about the ledger. The copy. The 3 people moved quickly through the city with sealed documents. She didn't know that the story was already escaping the walls that had been built to contain it. She didn't know that 40 years of careful, coordinated erasure was unraveling in the space of a morning because one old man couldn't bring himself to burn 4 words. She is already here. She didn't know. But she was standing in the arena, in the silence, with the monster kneeling at her feet. And the iron rope around her wrists had never felt so temporary. The truth, when it has been buried long enough, doesn't emerge quietly. It doesn't tiptoe out. It arrives the way the monster arrived through those gates. Felt before it's seen. And by the time the kingdom felt it that morning, It was already too late to close the gates again. The truth didn't announce itself. It rarely does. It moved through the kingdom the way water moves through old stone, not dramatically, not all at once, but finding every crack, every gap, every place where the mortar had always been thinner than it looked. By midday, the documents had been read by enough people that containing them was no longer a question anyone with sense was asking. By evening, the scholar had given a public account in the university square to a crowd that kept growing at the edges. By the following morning, every merchant quarter, every tavern, every kitchen and corridor and street corner in the city was having the same conversation. The Draven bloodline. The covenant. The child they had hidden in plain sight for 17 years. The execution they had almost carried out. Almost. The consequences came without drama. That surprised people afterward. They had expected something louder. Arrests at sword point. Public confrontations. The satisfying spectacle of powerful people being visibly, dramatically brought low. It wasn't like that. Lord Casson resigned his position on a Tuesday morning, in writing, with the precise and measured language of a man who had spent his life controlling narratives and understood when one had finally escaped him. He offered no defense. No explanation. Just the resignation, and then silence. The archivist, the one who hadn't burned the ledger, was permitted to retire. The king's quiet decision. No charges, no ceremony. He left on a Wednesday, carrying 2 boxes of personal belongings, and nobody watched him go except a junior clerk who held the door open without quite meeting his eyes. The witnesses from the trial recanted. Not all at once. One by one over the following weeks. Each account was slightly different in its particulars, identical in its essential admission: they had been afraid. They had been pressured. They had told a version of the truth that had been shaped for them in advance. Dara's account was the most detailed. She gave it in writing, unprompted, 3 weeks after the arena. 4 pages. Her handwriting was very even throughout, which Lena, reading it later, understood had cost her something. She sent back a single line. I know. I understood then. We're all right. She meant it. Seraphine was the most complicated. She did not resign. Did not confess. Did not perform remorse in any of the ways the kingdom might have found satisfying. What she did was quieter and, in its own way, more devastating. She simply became irrelevant. Power, when it is built entirely on the maintenance of a particular story, has no foundation once the story changes. She had understood this better than anyone. Had spent decades ensuring the story never changed. She sat in the palace and the palace continued around her, and the people who had orbited her authority for years slowly, without announcement, began orienting themselves elsewhere. No dramatic fall. No public reckoning she could position herself against. Just the gradual, complete withdrawal of the thing she had organized her entire life around. Lena, when asked later whether she wanted anything from Seraphine, any formal acknowledgement, any accounting, anything, thought about it seriously. No, she said. And meant it. Not from generosity. Not from weakness. From the clear-eyed understanding that some people carry their punishment inside them, and that adding to it from the outside would cost her energy she had better use for. Aldrich abdicated 11 weeks later. It was his own decision. Reached slowly, honestly, without anyone pushing him toward it. He requested one conversation with Lena before he left. She agreed to it. They sat in a small room on the east side of the palace, the side she knew well, the corridors she'd navigated since childhood, and he spoke for a long time about things he should have done differently. About the morning she arrived. About the sealed letter he'd accepted without opening. About 17 years of looking slightly away whenever she entered a room. He didn't ask for forgiveness. That, she respected. She listened to everything he said. Then she told him the truth, that the cruelty he was most guilty of was not malice but cowardice, and that she had made her peace with it, and that she hoped he eventually would too. He left the kingdom 3 days later. She watched him go from an upper window. She didn't feel what she expected to feel. She felt, mostly, tired. And underneath the tired, very quietly, something that would eventually become relief. Here's what Lena did not do. She did not stand in the arena and claim the throne dramatically while 10,000 people cheered. She did not issue proclamations or wear crowns or move into the royal chambers the same week the truth came out. She did not perform what had been done to her as a kind of answer, reach for power quickly, the way people who have been denied things sometimes do, mistaking accumulation for healing. She spent the first week sleeping, eating proper meals, walking the lower corridors at 4 in the morning simply because she wanted to, not because the palace was safer in the dark. She visited the kitchens. Bess was still there, working, pretending nothing had changed, pretending she hadn't heard everything. Lena sat at the work table and didn't say anything for a while. Bess chopped things that didn't need chopping. Then set down the knife. Turned around. Looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy and is finally, carefully, setting it down. Larger portion, Lena said. Bess made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. And that was that. The question the kingdom kept asking, the one that appeared in every account, every conversation, every piece of writing from that period, was what Lena would do next. What she would claim. What she would demand. How she would use it. She answered it slowly, in her own time, in the way she did most things. She didn't reach for the throne. She reached for the records. Every missing document. Every sealed archive. Every piece of history that had been removed, reclassified, rewritten, or simply erased because it was inconvenient to someone's version of events. She commissioned a complete restoration. Not curated. Not shaped. All of it, including the parts that reflected badly on the Draven line itself, including the complicated and messy and unflattering truths that a more politically minded person might have chosen to quietly leave buried. People deserve to know what actually happened, she said, when someone asked why she was including the difficult material. Even the parts that make us look bad, they asked. Especially those, she said. The creature was not returned to the chamber beneath the palace. That was her first official act, if you could call it that. The chains were removed. The gates were opened. And the royal monster, the thing that had terrified a kingdom for 3 centuries, the execution weapon, the creature they had kept in the dark and called a monster because it was easier than remembering what it had once been, walked out. Into the courtyard. Into the light. It stood there for a long moment, blinking slowly in a way that was almost disorienting to witness, this enormous, ancient, formidable thing, simply standing in sunlight, taking it in. Then it turned. And walked to where Lena was standing. And stopped beside her. Not behind her. Not in front of her. Beside her. The way someone walks beside a person they have been waiting a very long time to walk beside. The scholars would spend years debating the precise nature of the covenant and what its restoration meant legally, theologically, historically. The people who had been in that courtyard on that particular morning didn't debate it at all. They simply watched the girl and the creature stand together in the light. And understood, without being able to fully articulate it, that they were seeing something return to what it had always been meant to be. Not a weapon. Not a monster. A guardian. And a kingdom's oldest promise, finally, imperfectly, honestly kept. They had tried to erase her. Had removed her name from records, her history from archives, her future from the space it was always meant to occupy. They had dressed their fear in the language of justice and called it necessary and slept at night inside the story they had written for themselves. And in the end, after all of it, she was still here. Not because power had protected her. Not because anyone had come to save her. Because the truth, when it belongs to you, cannot be permanently taken. It can be buried. It can be hidden. It can be surrounded by guards and sealed in wax and sentenced to death in a public arena. And it will still find its way back to the surface. Because that is the nature of things that are real. They persist. And the people who build their power on the erasure of someone else's truth will always, eventually, find themselves standing in an arena they constructed, watching it kneel. Her name was Lena. And the kingdom, finally, after everything, said it out loud.